Hello, and welcome to the new episode of my course, Learning German with the Bible. Please excuse that I was absent for some time. I had a lot of stuff going on in real life, but now in the next few weeks I should find more time to edit and record these tutorials. Let's get right into it. So today I decided to mix up the structure of my talks a little bit. We are going to use 3 versions of the Bible in 3 languages as our base, and then we are going to use additional German translations to supplement our reading, and that way I can explain various words and their nuances, what they mean. So for our German Bible, we're going to use the Schlachter 2000 version. For the English, we're going to use the King James version, and for the Hebrew, we're going to use the Westminster Leningrad Codex. Additional German translations are going to be the Hoffnung für alle, Neue Übersetzung, Luther 1545, and Couch and Weizsäcker translation. Today we're going to take a look at Genesis 1, verse 6. In the German Schlachter 2000 translation, it reads as: Und Gott sprach, es wird eine Ausdehnung inmitten der Wasser. Die bilde eine Scheidung zwischen den Wassern. The English King James version renders this verse as: And God said, Let there be a firmament in the midst of the waters, and let it divide the waters from the waters. In Hebrew, it reads as: Vayomer Elohim yehi rakia betok hamayim vehi mabdil ben mayim lamayim. And we're going to look into the nuances of the Hebrew and how it affects the German and English translations a bit later. First, let's take a look at this first construction, und Gott sprach, because there are different ways to translate this in German. So, for example, in the Hoffnung für alle translation, it is translated as und Gott befahl, which means and God commanded, which honestly doesn't make a lot of sense, because the word omer or vayomer in Hebrew never really means to command or to give an order. It usually just means to speak. It's one of the most common words in the Hebrew Bible. It appears like 1,500 times in the Old Testament, and it rarely means something like to command. It usually just means to say. So the translators of the Hoffnung für alle Bible took a bit of a creative liberty, a bit of an artistic license here in translating it like that, and we should be aware of that. Now the Neue Übersetzung and the Couch and Weizsäcker have a somewhat different translation. They render it as Dann sprach Gott, which could roughly be translated as Then spoke God, and Couch and Weizsäcker translated as Da sprach Gott, which I would translate as Was spoke God. Now, if you look at the Hebrew, this is actually a very good translation, because in Hebrew, Vayomer Elohim literally means and spoke or and said God. The Va at the beginning of a word indicates that this action is happening in addition to another action or thing. So Vayomer means and spoke, Elohim, God. So by changing the structure of the sentence and including the particles dann or da, the translators of these translations actually preserve the original Hebrew word order, which I think is very good if you want to stay faithful to the original Hebrew. Next, I would like to take a look at the es werde construction, which is translated as let there be in English, and which in Hebrew originally means yehi. So I think I mentioned earlier that there's really no good way to translate es werde into English. It will just have to suffice to say that it means something like let there be in English. However, there are other ways to translate this verse into German. For example, in the Schlachter 1951 translation, it is translated as es soll, which means something like there shall. Soll means shall. So that would be another possible translation for the Hebrew construction yehi. Next, let's take a look at the Hebrew word rakia, which is translated as a firmament in English, and which in the Schlachter 2000 translation is rendered as eine Ausdehnung. Eine Ausdehnung, what is that? The word Ausdehnung is made up of 2 German words, 1 particle and 1 verb. Aus, which means something like out, and dehnen, which means to stretch. So an Ausdehnung is an outstretching. It means an expanse, a space. Wie Hoffnung für alle and Neue Übersetzung translation render this word rakia as ein Gewölbe or eine Wölbung. Both words are related to each other. The word Gewölbe is extremely rare, and I think it only appears in the Bible and other really old texts. It's not a word that you will commonly find outside of the Bible, outside of old texts in everyday spoken German. The word Wölbung is also rather rare, but you won't look like a total weirdo for using it. Wölbung means something like bulge, or in this context it means a dome. It is derived from the word wölben, which means to bend or to turn. This word is actually related to the Proto-Indo-European word culpe, which is related to the Latin word culpa, which means guilt, mistake, or wrong. That's where the English word culpability comes from. You know, someone who is culpa, who is guilty, is kind of a twisted individual, someone who is bent, turned, twisted. So that's an unexpected relative to a German word that is also rather obscure. Now we come to my favorite translation of the word, which we can find in Luther 1545 and in Couch and Weizsäcker, which is eine Feste, or in Couch and Weizsäcker, eine Feste, but written with a V. Couch and Weizsäcker were Swiss theologians, and their translation is actually really old. I looked it up and I thought it would be like 15 years or so. No, it was actually over 100 years old. And that time in Switzerland they used a bit of an alternative orthography. That's why they wrote Feste with a V, really, in everyday German, really in all accepted German orthographies. Feste or Fest is written with a F. That's why I made a little star to indicate that this is wrong. However, the word Feste is very good to translate the Hebrew concept of rakia, because Feste or Fest means something hard, something stiff, something tight, or something firm, like a firmament, for example. The German word fest is related to the English word fast, but not fast as in quick or speedy, but fast as in to hold fast, to really grab it tightly. And the Hebrew word rakia, what the authors of the Bible imagined when they wrote rakia, was something like a big dome in the sky, like something made out of glass or stone, something like that. That's what they thought the rakia, the expanse, the firmament, the sky, actually was. It's a bit difficult for us to imagine because we don't really think of the sky like a big dome, like a big snow globe. We think of it more like a lot of air, like a lot of space. If I had to give you one example of what you could imagine the Hebrew concept of a rakia to be, I would say it would be something like Stephen King's novel Under the Dome, with this big structure that is kind of like glass but indestructible, just appears out of nowhere. But it's probably similar to what the Hebrew authors of the Bible thought about the dome in the sky and how it was created. I don't know, maybe Stephen King actually was inspired by the biblical text. I wouldn't be surprised about it. Next, let's take a look at the construction inmitten der Wasser, which is translated as in the midst of waters in English, and which both derive from the Hebrew betok hamayim. Now the German inmitten der Wasser literally means in the midst of waters. So here the King James translation and the German Schlachter 2000 translation are converging quite nicely. However, this is really not fitting to translate the Hebrew concept of betok hamayim. The Hoffnung für alle translation simply renders the passage as im Wasser, which would mean in the water, which in my opinion is even more wrong and misses the point. In this case, it is Luther's translation, but is actually right. He renders the passage as zwischen den Wassern. Zwischen is the German word for between. So Luther writes between the waters, which is exactly what the Hebrew betok hamayim would mean. Now, the Neue Übersetzung also uses the word zwischen to mean between, but it says zwischen Wasser und Wasser, which would mean between water and water. Really, there's no place in the Hebrew for a second water. It would just mean between the waters, not between water and water. So this is, I get the point, but it's not really right. Finally, Couch and Weizsäcker render the passage as inmitten der Gewässer. Now, we already talked about the word inmitten. It just means in the middle or in the midst. Gewässer is a somewhat obscure German word. It is derived from the word Wasser, which means water, and also means water in almost any case. So there's a very fine nuance in translating Gewässer. And it's not very easy to explain. The best thing I could come up with would be to say that Gewässer means something like lake or sea, not just water as a concept. For example, I can have a glass of water, but that would never be a Gewässer. So Gewässer always means a large body of water. Now let's come to Vihi Mabdil and let it divide, or Die bilde eine Scheidung. In German, what does that mean? To translate Die bilde eine Scheidung literally, I would say, may it form a separation. Now the grammar in this passage is rather convoluted, so I'm not going to try to explain it to you right now. It's better that we leave this for later. The verb bilde means to form or to shape. Now, bilden may sound similar to the English word to build, but it is actually unrelated to it, even though I expected this to be the case. Martin Luther offers us a different translation, rendering it as und die sei ein Unterschied, which would mean and let it be a difference. The word Scheidung and Unterschied are actually related to each other. Both derive from the verb scheiden, which means to separate. Scheidung, as I explained in an earlier video, can mean a divorce or a separation, and Unterschied means a difference. The word scheiden is rather interesting, not just because it is the foundation of different German words, but because it is also related to a bunch of other words in other languages. The word scheiden is derived from the Proto-Indo-European word skei, which means to split. It also has a number of cognates in other languages. For example, Sanskrit kyati, which means to cut, Church Slavonic chiliti, which means to filter or to strain, Latin cedere, to cut. I think this is also where the word decision comes from, or ancient Greek schizo, which is where we get schizophrenia from. You know, schizophrenic is someone with a split mind of sorts. It is also related to the English word, oh, and not go, can I say it? Well, you can imagine what it means. And I wouldn't use such a profane word if I didn't have a good reason to mention it. What is that reason? Well, in German, there are a whole bunch of words that are all derived from this verb scheiden. For example, die Scheidung, which means divorce, die Entscheidung, which means a decision, die Ausscheidung, which means an emission of bodily fluid, for example, an excrement. So it may be indirectly related to the English profane word for excrements. Die Wasserscheide, which is watershed. If you don't know what that is a concept in hydronomics to determine where the water that falls down in a rainfall will flow to in the end. And there's der Unterschied, which means a difference. There's also the adjective verschieden, which means different. Now let's take a look at the last construct, zwischen den Wassern, which is translated as the waters from waters in English and is derived from the Hebrew ben mayim, lamayim. Now in Couch and Weizsäcker's translation, the passage is rendered as zwischen den verschiedenen Gewässern, so again, between the different bodies of water. Now, the Neuübersetzung renders this passage as zwischen Wasser und Wasser, which, if you look at the Hebrew, is almost correct. Ben Mayim, Lamayim means something like between the waters, from the waters. The Hebrew particle la usually denotes something like from or to. Alright, with that, we have covered the entire verse. Now, I would like to take one more look at the passage. This time, I decided to translate the entire passage from the Hebrew, both into English and into German, by being as literal as possible. In this way, both the German and the English translation converge almost literally to each other, and it might be interesting for you to see how the passage would look like if you tried to read it as literally as possible. So, to translate Vayomer Elohim Yehi Rakia Betok Hamayim Vai Mabdir Ben Mayim Lamayim into English, I would render it as Thus spoke God, let there be a firmament in the midst of the waters, and let it divide between the waters from the waters. In German, I would render this passage as Da sprach Gott, es werde eine Feste inmitten der Wasser, und die scheide zwischen den Wassern von den Wassern. Thank you very much. That is all that I have to say today. Please excuse me for not recording any episodes recently. I've had a lot of stuff going on in my life, but I hope that from now on I can follow a more regular schedule. I'm looking forward to teaching you next week. I hope you have a great time. See you.